Thank you all for coming. And thank you for the panelists, some of whom drove all the way from Billings, so it's quite the drive. We appreciate that. My name is Emily Lucas. This is Fallon Stanton and Haley Nelson. We organized this panel as part of a community project for our domestic violence class, a course that's taught every other year by Professor Andrew King Reese. Thank you to the Women's Law Caucus who sponsored the event, provided the cookies and coffee. There's a sign-in sheet going around, so make sure that you're able to get your name on the sign-up sheet so that you can get CLE credit. Also, if you didn't get a handout, there's some in the back, and they're also available on the university webpage. We have 5 speakers today. Each speaker is going to talk for about 15 to 20 minutes. We'll take a break after the first 3, and when the panelists are done presenting, there'll be time for a break. I'm going to turn it over to Fallon, who's going to introduce the topic for today's panel.
Hi. So today we kind of combine 2 very distinct and complex topics. We're going to talk about victims of sex trafficking and victims of domestic violence that are immigrants. And they are very distinct topics with a lot of differences to them, but we decided to combine them because there are a lot of crossovers in terms of things to recognize, signs that they're victims, and also resources or remedies that are available to them. So that's why we decided to combine them. Today we have panelists who have experience with one area or the other, and some people have experience with both. So we're very lucky to have all of these people here today, and hopefully they will be able to give us an idea of why both of these areas are huge issues in Montana and becoming increasingly bigger issues in Montana, as well as what kind of things we can do to recognize signs that people are victims, what kind of resources there are available, and what kind of help we can provide to them.
Hello, my name's Haley Nelson, and I have the great pleasure of introducing our speakers. We've pulled together some of the best people in the state to talk about these issues, so thank you so much for coming today and honoring their efforts and our efforts to put this together. Our first speaker is Shahid Haque, and that was my attempt. He's a lawyer from Helena who focuses on immigration law, especially doing pro bono work to help immigrants receive legal status in the United States. He currently works for border crossing law firm in Helena and with Montana Legal Services Association. He has worked with many immigrant victims of domestic abuse. So we're very happy to have him here from Helena. Lori Greigel is our next panelist. She is the managing attorney for Montana Legal Services Association in the Billings office. Her work focuses on representing domestic violence victims in civil matters. Ms. Greigel focuses on underserved populations, including Native Americans, and she has worked with immigrant victims of domestic abuse in Montana. And one thing I should note is that at times you might hear the term mail order bride come up, and that we will have a discussion about how that sometimes is not, or often is not an appropriate term, but it is thrown around in the media. It is kind of a term that can be used to describe immigrants who come over under false pretenses and then end up being abuse victims. So that'll be part of our discussion. Cynthia Wolken, who we're lucky to have, she's a lawyer and a Missoula City Commission member. She did a 2-year fellowship with Montana Legal Services that focused on immigrant victims of domestic violence, and she helped draft and pass Montana's first criminal laws against human trafficking in 2007. So it is a crime under state law, human trafficking, but that only dates to 2007. And she is also the acting chair of the Montana Human Rights Commission. Jennifer Gursky is here. She is a first-term Montana legislator representing House District 98 here in Missoula. And this session, she co-sponsored a resolution that would have created an interim committee to study human trafficking in Montana. Unfortunately, that didn't pass, but we applaud her efforts to try to raise awareness about these issues. And she also co-sponsored House Bill 478 that was passed. It strengthened the criminal provisions of Montana's human trafficking laws, and it was signed by Governor Bullock on May 1st. And last but certainly not least, we're very happy to have Robert Carlson here. He is a Butte attorney and shareholder at the law firm of Corrett, Pullman, and Keeby. Did I say that right? His practice focuses on civil insurance defense and products liability, but on August 7th, 2012, he became chair of the American Bar Association's House of Delegates, so we're happy to have a Butte boy in there. of which he has been a member since 1999. Mr. Carlson has also been active in the State Bar of Montana, including a term as president. So please join me in welcoming our panelists, and I would like to note this CLIA is scheduled to go until 5:10. We are going to take a 10-minute break. And after our panelists have each finished speaking, there will be time for questions. However, I request that any questions be spoken into the microphone. I'll be running around with it so that we can all hear. So please welcome our panelists, and I'll turn it over to them.
Well, my name is Shahid Haque, and hopefully you guys can hear me okay. My phone's working. So I am an immigration attorney, and I'll be speaking about the topics from that perspective. And I just wanted to make clear, I'm glad that you guys mentioned that we are kind of, in a way, mixing two different concepts. The concept of human trafficking and sex trafficking, and the concept of domestic abuse victims who are here on one form of immigration status or another, or maybe lacking status of any kind here in the country. So. What I have done is over the last 5 years or so, I've been practicing here. Prior to that, I was immigration law in Chicago, and through my law practice as well as free legal clinics and workshops that I've held in different cities throughout the state, I've come into contact with a large number, somewhere between 2,000 to 3,000 immigrants or family members, immediate family members of those immigrants who have shared their stories with me, either because I represent them in cases or because they've told me their stories and I've consulted with them and maybe haven't represented them. So when you're talking about the population of immigrants in the state of Montana, that's a fairly significant chunk. And so I only mentioned that to know that the experiences that I'm going to share and kind of my view of where things are fairly representative of a certain segment of the population. But I have never in my entire career come into contact with anyone who was a victim of human trafficking or any person who told me anything about the existence of human trafficking in the state of Montana. So I will also just want to, for clarity, I have not personally encountered human trafficking. I'm speaking more about immigrant victims of domestic violence, which is something that's occurring in Montana quite a bit. And so it's a problem that I think is under-recognized, and although there isn't legislation in state courts that's intended to directly address immigrant victims of domestic violence, it's sorely needed, and there are many instances in which law enforcement, as I'll discuss, have created really bad situations for domestic violence victims who lack immigration status. And I want to kind of run through a case study of that just to give you an illustration of what I'm talking about. And I know Lori has had certain cases where domestic abuse victims have been treated disparately in the court system, and there are lots of things to discuss as far as that goes. We're just going to get about 20 minutes or so to talk, so we can't delve into all of them, but we'll give you a broad overview of kind of our different perspectives on the issue. So, like you guys mentioned in the introduction, the term mail-order brides, I do think that's a good thing to just get out of the way right up front. So I think terminology really matters. Language you use to discuss an issue frames people's perspectives about it, and it actually kind of shapes policy in its own way. And so I wanted to talk about the term mail-order brides and why I don't think that term is particularly accurate or representative of the segments here in Montana or even anywhere in the country. So, except in very rare instances, in my view, the term mail-order brides is really a misnomer because it's not accurate, and it also has some offensive and sexist undertones to the term as well. So, first of all, the term mail-order brides, it implies that the immigrant spouse or the person tagged with that term is actually complicit in wanting to evade immigration laws and enter into a fake marriage specifically for the purpose of getting immigration benefit. It implies that the spouse is complicit in that. I mean, the very term mail-order bride is pejorative in a sense because it says that both parties are somehow complicit in this arrangement to enter into a superficial or fake marriage to get immigration benefits. And in my experience, that isn't representative of what's happening here in Montana, and it actually is what I'm seeing more often is that spouses enter the country to enter into legitimate marriages, or if they're already here, they like everyone else, ultimately enter into a relationship and begin a life together with a U.S. citizen spouse. And what happens far more often is that the relationship changes and starts to take a turn where the U.S. citizen's abusive tendencies start to manifest, and then ultimately turns into an abusive relationship where the spouse is trapped, and ultimately some of them hopefully get out of it and start looking for remedies, others may not. And so just the idea that mail order brides as a term has to be very carefully used. There may be certain instances in which the term might be accurate, but those would be the rare instances. And so when a term like what the problem is that a term like mail order brides ends up being thrown about in situations where it doesn't apply at all. The one misconception with the term is that somehow it's just that easy to get an immigrant spouse into the United States. You can pick them out of the catalog, choose them, bring them over here, and there you go, you've got your mail order bride. In fact, unless the immigrant spouse that you're talking about has literally been brought over through human trafficking and has not gone through immigration channels to obtain a visa of any kind, but has in fact been trafficked into the country and then sold into a marriage and then held in that marriage against their will, you're not really talking about a mail order bride. And so there are very rigorous standards for the Department of Homeland Security's issuance of fiancé visas and marriage visas, and you have to go through and prove that the relationship is bona fide. And what I've seen more often than not is that legitimate relationships that don't meet certain preconceived notions about what a real marriage looks like, that are actually non-typical marriages, either due to age differences, language differences, religious differences, maybe one spouse not taking the other one's name, different things that in an adjudicator's view makes that relationship not look real, are impacted, where they're denied and found to not have proven a genuine marriage. And certain countries have more problems with that than others, and it's just a fact of life, and you know that, dealing with the Department of State consulates abroad. If you're in Nigeria, if you're a U.S. citizen who wants to marry a Nigerian, you're going to have a very hard time. I see so many unjustified denials of those visas, and China as well, and there are other countries that are like that as well. And so we've gone through and literally printed out years worth of chat transcripts and emails and letters and sent it in and still had denials based on, in one case, the fact that the adjudicator said that, according to him, the chat transcripts were there was such a language barrier there that, in his view, it was nonsense. Like, he couldn't understand, but clearly they had been communicating for months, so they could understand each other just fine. So what I've been concerned about is the use of mail order brides as a term that kind of starts to cover situations where it doesn't apply. Any marriage to a foreign spouse could be subject to the idea that maybe that's a mail order bride situation. And in fact, what you'd really be talking about with mail order brides is a situation that was relatively rare, where a person is literally posing in a magazine because they are part of a sex trafficking operation. They are held in indentured servitude against their will. The fact that they've been brought into the United States is against their will, and that would be a mail order bride situation. So if you can't apply the term the way, in a limited context, it should be applied, then just don't use it in that perspective. So going to the actual issue of immigrant victims of domestic violence and kind of what I've seen in my experiences. Most immigrant victims of domestic violence have entered the country on a family-based visa petition. And that could be a fiancé visa petition, where the U.S. citizen spouse has to prove that they have met the immigrant spouse within the last 2 years, they have begun a relationship, and they have to prove how that relationship began and the fact that they've met. So you're talking about proving plane tickets, proving that you've met, and pictures of you guys together in the last 2 years. And then showing how your relationship developed through documentary evidence of some kind or another, supporting statements from friends and family members who verified that this is a bona fide relationship. And then what a fiancé visa is all about is you get a visa to enter the United States as a fiancé, and then within 90 days you actually have to get married. And if you don't get married within that 90 days, the immigrant spouse loses her status, his or her status. And so what you see in abusive relationships sometimes is using the fiancé visa process to bring over a spouse and then deliberately failing to actually get married, deliberately not getting married, so that the person is now out of status and their entire status depends on you, but they may not understand the full contours of their ability to get in status again or not. Other times they will actually get married, but maybe not file the paperwork and hold that paperwork over the immigrant spouse's head as a means of having control over them. So you'd have to file for the actual green card in order to get work authorization, in order to get a driver's license, in order to basically do a lot of what you need to do to function in society. And abusive spouses will use that to their advantage. In fact, that's likely why the abusive spouse has petitioned for the immigrant, but it's without the immigrant spouse's knowledge in my experience. It's not like they're getting into it on purpose just to get the visa. This is something that's kind of sprung on them after they get here. So other times, so this is the Violence Against Women's Act, which is a means of petitioning for immigrant spouses to get immigration status when the person who would traditionally petition for them, the U.S. citizen spouse, won't do it due to abuse, and the Violence Against Women's Act provides a means to do that. VAWA will actually provide an opportunity for people who enter the country illegally, in other words, just crossing the border without inspection, to have a means of obtaining immigration status that might not even be available to them through traditional green card application process, but if they can prove abuse. And the reason for that is because it's so prevalent. And Congress obviously didn't want to have a permanent underclass of undocumented people who could be exploited by abusive U.S. citizen spouses with no remedy available to them. So for that purpose, you've got to allow a pathway to legalize your status if you prove domestic abuse in your situation. So in terms of typical behaviors of abusive spouses, I mentioned kind of withholding anything that would allow the spouse a form of identification so that they can be autonomous. So it's all about isolating the immigrant spouse, and that's part of why domestic abuse is such an issue in Montana is the isolation. There are places in Montana where you can be very isolated, and if you don't have a driver's license or access to a car, you might spend quite a while without seeing another human being, and you might not have a means of really interacting with others to either share what's happening or to have somebody who's looking out for you or worried about you. So making it hard to engage in social relationships, restricting telephone access in some instances, I've seen that quite a bit. Making it so that the immigrant spouse doesn't have, in kind of one instance, it'd be cutting off long-distance phone calls and not letting them have a cell phone so that they can't call home to talk to their family member. In another instance, it'd be not allowing telephone access at all. And the another thing is basically controlling all aspects of the immigrant spouse's life. And in some instances, what I've seen is that the abusive U.S. citizen spouse is a little bit of a deadbeat. I mean, he or she doesn't work, and actually, despite refusing to petition for the immigrant spouse and get them work authorization, is having the immigrant spouse be the primary wage earner for the family. And so what's happening in that context is the abusive spouse is forcing the immigrant spouse into a situation where they're working without authorization and being asked to provide for the entire family. And then that leads to, oftentimes, what I've seen is encouragement for the abused spouse to actually violate the law by working without authorization, but also encouraging them to violate the law in other ways if the abusive spouse can find a means of controlling that person to do that. So that is a big issue that I've seen where law enforcement in the state of Montana has not been sympathetic to the situation of an abused spouse who is in such a pattern and cycle of abuse lasting for so many years that spouse is being coerced into, in some instances, violating the law. And there's just no mechanism in our current system to understand what that immigrant spouse is going through and actually kind of understand the extenuating circumstances involved in that situation. But it's something that's happening, and I don't know that it's very well understood. The abusive spouses often, I've seen just excessive instances of texting, sometimes like 100 texts in a week, or, not in a week, like 100 texts in a day. And sometimes even in violation of orders of protection after they've broken up and moved on. But another way of maintaining control over the spouse is the threat of deportation. The threat that if you don't do exactly what that U.S. citizen spouse is saying, they will report you to Immigration and Customs Enforcement, who will be more than happy to put you into deportation proceedings and get you kicked out of the country. And so a lot of times you're dealing with an immigrant spouse who has multiple children with the abuser, and they're worried about what would happen to the children if they were deported. And if they were deported, the children would likely go to the abuser, because in our family court system, maybe we're going to talk about this too, family court judges really don't find it within their authority, or don't typically award custody to a spouse that's departing the country. So it just doesn't happen. And so even if the deportation is unjustified, they tend to, even the fact that deportation proceedings are pending, family court judges use that as a basis to award custody to an abusive spouse, and I've seen that. But so in terms of the fact that I know just mentioning how law enforcement doesn't really deal with domestic violence victims always in the most appropriate way. There are things that the Montana legislature has tried to do to actually make the situation worse, but thankfully people like Jen Dursky have helped kill that type of legislation. So having served on the House Judiciary Committee this last session, she heard some of that. But when the state gets into the business of bringing local law enforcement, requiring local law enforcement to inquire into immigration status, there are serious ramifications for victims of domestic violence, because they will not report the abuse that's occurring to them or their children if the local police officers will then inquire into their immigration status and potentially put them in deportation proceedings. So it's a serious issue. But even in the absence of specific laws requiring them to check into it, a lot of law enforcement officers will check even though they're not really supposed to. And so basically the idea is that there's a lack of understanding and sympathy towards domestic violence victims, who, especially ones who are immigrants, who are ultimately unlawfully present. And a lot of times the unlawful presence is because the U.S. citizen spouse chose not to petition for them even though they were married. So I've had clients who've been married for 5 years, and they have multiple children. And there's just really no reasonable basis for why there's been no immigration petition filed. So I mean, if I had my way, I think the law would automatically presume that in an instance where 5 years have gone by, or even more than a couple of years have gone by, and the U.S. citizen spouse hasn't petitioned for the immigrant spouse, there has got to be some presumption that perhaps there's domestic abuse going on, because there's just no reason that in that instance, if you've legally entered the country on one visa or another, and you're married to a U.S. citizen, there should be no bar to adjustment of status in most instances. And so the failure to petition in and of itself is suspect, but I don't think ICE sees it that way. The immigration officials don't necessarily see it that way. But one case study that I wanted to just briefly run through is a situation that I'm presently dealing with right now, and it kind of provides an example. So I'm going to talk about it in like hypothetical terms and omit information that hopefully will not reveal who I'm talking about. So you'd be dealing with somebody who could have been here for many years, and over 15 years in some instances, where the person had come in on a temporary work visa, but ultimately got married to a U.S. citizen, had many children together, but oftentimes the immigrant victim is lied to, flat out lied to. So what you're dealing with is in a U.S. citizen spouse who exhibits obsessive tendencies towards towards their spouse, the immigrant spouse. And so those obsessive tendencies can appear like, like the spouse loves the person so much that they just have to know everything about the person, and it kind of, it's this just oppressive situation. But in my cases, a lot of my clients never suspected that their spouse had lied and really hadn't filed immigration paperwork for them. They thought he wouldn't ever do that, although his obsessive behavior is very strange and oppressive sometimes. it's because he loves the person so much. He wouldn't lie to them in that way, but that's what happened in a lot of instances. So there's no immigration petition filed, even though the person believes that it's been filed. And then things go on forever, where the domestic violence victim doesn't have direct contact with the supposed immigration lawyers, and they get updates every once in a while about how, oh, the paperwork was rejected, we had to resubmit it, and things of that nature. So ultimately, working without status for many years, you put in the situation of being a primary breadwinner for the family, despite not having valid work authorization, being coerced to commit minor crimes like write a bad check or use somebody else's credit card, things of that nature. Those will ultimately create penalties that are heaped on the abused spouse and not the U.S. citizen who's actually coercing the person to commit these crimes. And, in order to understand kind of what you're dealing with, you have to just imagine 5 years of just being beaten down and oppressed. And sometimes it's physical cruelty, other times it's just extreme emotional cruelty. But once this person finally decided that she was going to get herself out of this abusive situation, file for divorce, leave the situation, very quickly there was an instance of partner family member assault where the spouse choked the domestic violence victim in police reports, very well documented. But immediately the abused spouse turned, the abusive spouse turned her into immigration authorities. And here in Montana we have fairly aggressive and active immigration and customs enforcement agents. And ICE's Office of Investigations, a couple of their main people are based out of Kalispell on Main Street, and they just have no understanding or sympathy for domestic abuse. And so what they did was actually, in violation of VAWA, they took a complaint from an abusive spouse and used that information to ultimately arrest and put the abused spouse into deportation proceedings. And there's a provision in VAWA that specifically says that ICE is not supposed to rely on information provided solely by an abusive spouse. And in this case, if they had done their homework, they could immediately uncover the fact that there was an abusive spouse involved because there was a partner family member assault and there was an order of protection in place. But they didn't do that. Instead, they put her into deportation proceedings. In fact, they went one step further. And most of the time, abused spouses get an opportunity to appear in immigration court. And if you go to immigration court, you have an opportunity to apply for relief under the Violence Against Women's Act. But in this instance, the person had entered on a particular form of visa, it's a visa waiver program, where you waive the right to appear in front of an immigration judge. You say that if you're found to be out of status and you entered on this particular visa, you've waived your right to appear in front of an immigration judge. So what they were able to do is actually summarily order deportation without giving this person the right to go to immigration court, without giving her any ability to raise the claim for validity. And so they stood ready to execute that deportation order. But to make matters worse, in the course of ICE's investigation and based on information provided by the abusive spouse who actually orchestrated these crimes, they managed to bring charges against the domestic violence victim for commission of certain minor, very minor crimes. So they withheld her deportation while they actually tried to convict her for some criminal charges. So in the meantime, I filed a claim for Violence Against Women's Act relief, even though she wasn't technically eligible for it. With an order of deportation, you're not technically eligible for relief from the ballot. But we filed it anyway because this was such an egregious case. And we, so what that did is cause a little bit of, I guess, legal confusion, and where ultimately they didn't quite know what they were going to do with the situation. And they also knew that they had exposure based on the pretty egregious conduct by the ICE officers in this case. So things were put on hold, but finally, a few months ago, they said that they were not going to delay any longer. They issued a final deportation order. What it said was she had to appear at their offices in Helena with a 40-pound bag and be ready to be taken into custody and put on ICE airlines and deported. So when we received that letter, we tried every last remedy we had to talk to them, talk some sense into them. Ultimately, what I was told on the phone was, there's nothing you can do to stop this. So in a way, they were right. In order of deportation, a final order of deportation is not something that's reviewable in the district court. in federal district court. They've actually, in 1996, they changed the laws, reworked it, so the federal district courts don't have authority to review an order of deportation. That you can actually file in the Ninth Circuit, but only on limited grounds, limited basis. And really the fact that she had a valid petition pending is not something that has been articulated as a basis to not be deported. And so what we actually did, though, is file in federal court on a writ of mandamus. And writ of mandamus is a form of relief that asks the district court to compel an officer of the federal government to perform the duties that they're obligated to perform. And by this point, it had been 18 months since we filed the ballot petition. And it was just sitting there pending. They weren't doing anything. In the meantime, ICE is trying to pursue final deportation. And so it's a perfect case for a writ of mandamus. And basically, it gave us an avenue to get into federal court, which is that we were asking the judge to issue a writ of mandamus compelling U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services to adjudicate the Violence Against Women's Act petition. They have to adjudicate it, and their irreparable harm women experiences my client's deportation and their separation from her children. So what happened is the judge granted that, granted a TRO preventing her immediate deportation as they asked for. And as on the eve of the preliminary injunction hearing, ICE finally, kind of USCIS finally approached us and said, all right, we have a couple more questions about the ballot petition. If you answer those, we will go forward from there. And we negotiated that they would prevent her deportation, stay her deportation until the Violence Against Women's Act petition was decided. So where we are now in that particular case is we've submitted all the evidence to demonstrate the abuse. There really should be no question about the fact that it's occurred. It's quite clear. And what should happen is hopefully the ballot petition is approved, in which case ICE at that point would be hard pressed to deport a confirmed approved ballot. And so they would hopefully lift the deportation order and not be able to deport her. Now, access to all the legal wranglings that we just did was a heck of a lot of work, and all pro bono, unpaid work, and the average domestic violence victim isn't going to have access to that kind of resources. So what we'd be left with if that hadn't happened was domestic violence victim having her deportation proceedings orchestrated by the abuser and have nobody sympathize or provide any relief for her, and she'd be separated from her kids right now. The kids would go to the abusive spouse, and she may or may not have any further contact with the kids, because once she's deported, there's a 10-year bar to being readmitted, and after 10 years, who knows what would happen, really. So I guess I need to turn it over because I've been talking for a really long time, but that's just kind of some of my experiences.
I'm Lori Greigel, and I'm a domestic violence attorney with Montana Legal Services. We talked a little bit ahead of time, and I think Cynthia's going to touch on a little bit about U visas, T visas, and VAWA petitions. She certainly was very experienced in that area in her time at Legal Services. So hopefully we're not going to duplicate too much of the material. I want to talk a little bit about cultural considerations that you need to understand for these immigrant victims of domestic violence. I also don't have experience with victims of trafficking because, frankly, just getting a domestic violence immigrant victim to get to us through a shelter or through coming to our offices is enough of a challenge, let alone a woman who's been trafficked. She certainly isn't going to be, able to help the neighbor to help her get out of the situation or something like that. This week on PBS, there was actually a special on a woman who was a third-generation Chinese American, actually was interested in kind of filming the process of a man bringing over a bride from another country, and she found a 60-year-old man in, I think it was Northern California, and followed the process of him finding a 30-year-old woman from China and bringing her over. And it was interesting to watch the dynamics because it wasn't a situation, as far as I could tell, where there was abuse involved, but just a lot of the dynamics between, so many gaps there, age barriers, culture barriers, language barriers. And it was interesting to watch that and watch this filmmaker kind of get involved. She had studied in China and was getting drawn in as sort of the impromptu interpreter whenever there was a crisis. So if you want to understand a little bit about some of what happens in these types of situations, it was interesting to watch. The other thing I want to talk about is there's the U visa study that I think there's several copies around it. It's sort of a national study that just came out from Legal Momentum. And the problem with law enforcement in Montana, you can see it's not unique to Montana. I think awareness in Montana probably is not nearly as high in many other places of the rights that immigrant victims of domestic violence has, but it is interesting to see how some of the problems we see in Montana are in places that you think that they would know better, frankly. It was a little refreshing to me because sometimes I tend to think that we're such a homogenous population that we just don't get it and we're unique in that sense. So it kind of interesting in light of some of the things that Shahid has gone through with his clients to look at that. In my work with Native American domestic violence victims, I see some pretty abused women. At the same time, I don't think that there's a person who's more helpless than an immigrant victim of domestic violence who has children that are U.S. citizens and basically is at the mercy of her abuser because if she doesn't go along with him, she'll never see her children again. She will be deported, but her children will remain here. They're U.S. citizens, and it's going to be very difficult for her to ever see her children again. That's a pretty powerful tool to put in someone's hands, and that's what happens in many cases. In terms of understanding what it would be like to come here, you have to understand that there's a lot of fear. I mean, they're afraid because deportation fears, language barriers. We don't hear a lot of different languages in Montana. We have a hard time finding interpreters in Spanish sometimes, which to me is amazing because right out of law school I worked in federal court in Tucson where we lived for a number of years. We had 2 staff interpreters that were certified Spanish interpreters, and we had interpreters all the time and there was never any issues with it. There's misinformation about the legal system. There's fear regarding law enforcement, not just ICE, but local law enforcement, and apparently it's quite justified, as you've heard in this state. There's issues of economic survival. Citizen victims of domestic violence often stay in an abusive situation because they don't have economic options. You've got 3 young kids, you don't have the ability to work, you can't afford a place of your own. Even if you get on public assistance, it's difficult to do when you have those things in your favor. If you're an immigrant victim and you don't have work authorization, it makes it even more difficult, and it makes it easier for the abuser to control you. There's also cultural and religious barriers oftentimes, especially I've seen it in some of the Asian cultures where if you leave, you are shaming your family. So to the extent, and I've seen that in other places, not as much here in Montana. If you leave your abuser and expose the domestic violence that has been going on, you are bringing shame on your family. And there are women who are shunned by their family, by their children, by their adult children for leaving some pretty horrific situations. So they have a lack of a support system. If they are fortunate enough to be in a place where they have other people who are from the same culture, if they leave, they may lose that support system. It's just, they probably feel almost like a Martian if you end up in Montana because it's rural. My clients, most of them have come from very heavily populated countries, and most of the time they're expected to be in isolated areas by themselves during the day and not have contact with people, and they're not put on bank accounts. The things that you need to do to show good faith marriage after 2 years, things like joint bank accounts, showing that you do the typical things that husbands and wives do. Lots of times it's difficult to do because the abuser will give you no access to economics, no access to work authorization or anything like that. So it's just, just really has them under their thumbs. Cynthia will talk, like I said, about some of the different types of relief. I wanted to talk a little bit about limited English proficiency because this is one of my soapboxes because it's an issue I've run into in this state. I just settled a case that involved an immigrant victim, and we requested an interpreter. The other side filed an objection, and the court set it for hearing. I was absolutely appalled. I don't know if you guys are appalled at that or not without understanding why I'm appalled, but I was flabbergasted. I emailed you. I was like, what's going on? What is it, this state? In 2000, President Clinton signed Executive Order 13166, which requires that any federal agency or any entity that receives federal funding is required to ensure meaningful access to persons of limited English proficiency. Well, look at our court system here. We have drug courts, we have veterans courts. Where's the funding from? Our courts do have a limited English proficiency plan, and in some of the materials there's a link to the website, and it allows the district, it says a district court shall appoint an interpreter for a limited English proficient person. My client had emailed back and forth with her husband prior to coming here. We settled 2 days before trial, thank God, because we had literally a stack of emails this thick that we were going to be going through. The first problem was he didn't want her to have an interpreter. It's not the other, and I just heard Angie at Legal Services was telling me there's a case in northern Montana where they're requesting an interpreter and the other side's objecting. It doesn't matter. That's not the choice of the other side. You are entitled to have that service, and here's the remedy. And the judge responded pretty quickly when I filed a brief that said, basically, if you do not provide these services, the U.S. Justice Department Civil Rights Division will investigate, and they are very active. Colorado just signed an MOU about a year ago, I believe it was. I don't know if you followed that at all. I was pretty surprised at the Colorado court system. And it's a pretty extensive MOU they had to sign. Maine, Florida, the Carolinas, I think Utah even had an issue with it, and the DOJ investigates, and that is not anything that any entity wants to deal with, is having the DOJ breathing down your neck. And when you look at some of the language assistant plans that result from this, they're pretty extensive. So in other words, if you screw up, be prepared for the DOJ to get involved, and then you will be providing quite extensive services, and you will be followed by the DOJ for some time. So be aware that that does not just apply to courts, it doesn't just apply to federal agencies. Montana Legal Services has a language assistant plan. Any entity that receives federal funding, United Way, should have a language assistance plan. We've worked through the coalition with the shelters to the Montana Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence to make sure they understand the requirements that they have for language assistance plans to be in place. I'm assuming a lot of you are attorneys and maybe have interest in family law and maybe doing pro bono work. So I want to let you know that if you do end up representing a victim of domestic violence that is a limited English proficient speaker, we'll make sure that you can use our language line. That's how we do it. We have a language line that has access to, probably over 200 languages. And if you are working with, in this part of the state, it would be Angie at Montana Legal Services. We will arrange for you to come and you work with an interpreter, usually in our office. You call the language line and it's you and your client and the interpreter. And so when you're working with your client, that language barrier will be diminished greatly. And then in the court proceedings, the court is required to appoint an interpreter. I'd kind of like to see a change in the policy where it's not just the district court appointing, but basically, like most places, if somebody self-identifies as limited English proficiency as an issue, they get an interpreter. The clerk's office can fill out the form and send it on and get it appointed. Then we wouldn't have this issue of adverse parties using it as a tool, trying to prevent the spouse from, the abused spouse from having the ability to understand the proceedings. It's just another tool that abusers use, and the reaction is, like in my case, her English is good enough. She emails, she's emailed him back and forth. And the ABA access to, they have some really good standards. I think I've quoted from them. Their guide on access to courts has some pretty good language. In fact, if I can find it quickly. I actually quoted this in a brief. If you do have any issues, get a hold of us and we'll get you the sources that you need. Let's see. I said I had that at my fingertips, but I don't. I lied. But the point that I want to make sure you guys understand, I want to get the word out that this is not an issue that's open for debate. Services must be provided, and if you run into that situation, you've got the weight of federal government behind you on it. And if, on the other hand, you're representing, everybody has a right, to hire an attorney to represent them, and if you are in a situation where you're representing an abuser, please don't use it as a tool. It's wrong. It's just wrong on so many levels. So that's one of the soapboxes that I personally, that I have, for this state. And like I said, it's not limited to here. The other thing to remember, if you are representing a person who has limited English proficiency, is you have an ethical duty to that client. And I think if you are not ensuring that that person has access to language services, you're violating that ethical duty. And if that's not enough to get you moving, there's also this thing called malpractice that lurks in every corner. So that's another motivation right there. Ironically, the woman who filed this practicing attorney who's practiced over 30 years in the Billings area that objected to us requesting an interpreter actually alleged that we were trying to perpetrate a fraud on the court when we requested an interpreter. And I had said, my client is conversant in English, she can hold a conversation, but holding a conversation one-on-one is completely different. So we have ways to go in this state, but we have a ways to go in this country to understand some of the issues that people have with limited English proficiency. I included some materials on what happens, if a woman can leave, and most of the time I'll refer to women because my clients that are immigrant victims have all been women. If she leaves, how is she going to get by? This state makes it fairly difficult to get public benefits. If you look at the materials, it talks about you have to be a qualified alien, which means you have to have had your paperwork filed. You have to hope that you can find a pro bono attorney who's generous enough to help you and get that filed. Meanwhile, you've left, you don't have your support system, and where are you going to stay? How are you going to get food? You're not going to get food stamps. You're not going to get TANF. You're pretty much up a creek. There are allowances. The federal government has issued another executive order, the Attorney General did, that basically says things that are necessary for health and safety can be provided. I think with the Montana Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence, and Sarah, tell me if I'm wrong, I think with legal services and the coalition, we've done a pretty good job of educating the shelters. That
I'm not going to say we haven't done a good job.
Because I have had shelters as the source for a lot of my clients. That they understand that they're not going to be prosecuted for harboring an undocumented person. In fact, they really have a duty to provide services. There's lots of services that can be provided, from counseling to medical care. But that immediate need to get immediate assistance, you can't run into the local Office of Public Assistance and get on food stamps so you can feed your kids if you were lucky enough to be able to take your kids with you. So there's some real difficulties to leaving when you are not a citizen and when you are from a different culture and you are a victim of violence in this country. There were some changes to VAWA that, I don't know if I included them in the material, that, how am I doing on time, that are encouraging. The latest version, stalking has now been added as a list of enumerated crimes for U visa, and Cynthia will talk about that. U visas are victim of crime visas, which you can file for if you're a victim of domestic violence, as well as other crimes. And also, there was a labor provision. Was it forced labor was added? There was one other provision that could be useful in the trafficking sense. But the fact that they've added stalking to the crime list for U visas is really encouraging, because I think of the U visa crimes that qualify. Like felony check charges. Those sorts of white collar crime aren't going to get you a U visa. It's usually crimes that involve violence, and stalking is one that hasn't been on there, and a lot of victims go through it, immigrant victims and non-victims, or non-immigrant victims. So we were glad to see VAWA finally pass. It was kind of held up in Congress for a while, and they did get some of the things passed that were helpful, that the advocates for immigrant victims were hoping for. Certainly not all of them, but it was encouraging to see those sorts of improvements made. Let's see if there's anything else that I want to talk about, since you're going to touch on U visas.
Sure, yeah, I can touch on it.
And let's see.
is that on? There we go. So I think that we've come a long way since I came and started my project in 2006, but I think, as Lori was saying, and Shahid, I think we still have a long way to go. When I first came to Montana, it was in 2006, and I had a 2-year SCADN fellowship, and it was to do trafficking and represent immigrant victims of domestic violence at Montana Legal Services, and I see a lot of my colleagues from Montana Legal Services here, so that's exciting. Human trafficking was a really sort of sexy topic then, and I think it still is. But I think, it's a good way to get funding for some of the other really important issues like just immigrant victims of domestic violence. My project was really ambitious and broad. It was to provide community education around trafficking, to do outreach to communities, and to help pass an anti-trafficking law, and then to do direct representation. And there was so much groundwork that needed to be done that it was, I thought I would just take a client and go into court and, we'd succeed. But I took clients into court and, that Lori's story reminded me of a Filipina client I had that we were up in Shelby, and luckily the judge is no longer on the bench, but he refused to provide any sort of interpretation for my client. She was a Tagalog speaker, and it would have been expensive, and it would have come out of his budget, and he just refused to do it. And we briefed it, and so in terms of just getting basic knowledge about what limited English proficiency is and what your legal duties are, and again, letting domestic violence shelters know that they're not going to be prosecuted for a felony if they house a potentially undocumented victim of violence. Just really basic things that even just having to work towards that so you can even begin to represent your clients in court. So I think that I'm glad that people are still fighting the good fight for that. I did a lot of, my clients were mostly what you would traditionally consider the brokerage clients. They came from places like Colombia, the Philippines, Eastern Europe, came here, good pretenses, thought they were in love and having a better quality of life, and really liked, had a legitimate bona fide relationship with their spouse, and then it turned violent, and there was really severe abuse in almost all of my cases. And because of all of the barriers, the time that immigrant victims stay in abusive relationships is much longer than their non-immigrant peers because of all the barriers. I had a client who, she was so isolated, there was no car, she was up in northern Montana, the only person she ever saw was the mailman who drove by once a day. And it took her, I think, almost 10 years to get out of that relationship. And again, Lori was talking about a lot of the cultural barriers. My clients from Colombia, all of them were heartbroken because very Catholic, that you don't get a divorce in their culture. They couldn't return home. They felt stigmatized. So they fought very hard almost to stay in a relationship and try to improve it until it became pretty clear that they couldn't. So I would say that the narrative around the mail order brides definitely doesn't hold up. And the narrative around human trafficking, I think nationally, doesn't really hold up in Montana. We have the media, and there's a lot of portrayals of sex trafficking as pretty Eastern European women who just come into brothels in urban areas. And yes, that happens, but in Montana, it's not something that I've seen, and a lot of practitioners, we just don't see that very often. We have really small, the sex trafficking victims that I had were from Mexico, and they were brought here by their abusers, and to prostitute them. One case was in Billings, I had another in Great Falls. And they wouldn't have come through to get to me except for they were arrested for prostitution. And I hate to bash law enforcement because I think it's an education issue, but there are just a lot of barriers right now for law enforcement to actually identify victims and get them the services they need rather than prosecute them. And I think the culture of demonization around the immigrant community that we've seen in the past 5 or 10 years has really affected that. So you guys have touched on some of the laws that have been proposed to sort of make local law enforcement the immigration enforcers, and it's really harmed women who suffer from domestic violence. What is this going to say? Oh, so the visas. I won't go into all of the requirements because there are several, but I never applied for a trafficking visa, a T visa for my clients because they were too difficult to get. I always applied for and did receive U visas. U visas are for crime victims, so you don't necessarily have to have, well, you don't have to have a relationship with the abuser, because oftentimes that's an issue with some of the other types of visas. You have to prove a certain relationship, but U visas, you just have to be a victim of a qualifying crime, and they like the crimes to be sort of, they're not necessarily, again, harassment's included, but it doesn't, and stalking is included, but it's not, there doesn't have to be physical violence, but it's sort of the threat of physical violence at least, or and a lot of the qualifying crimes are assault and battery, and so we use those, and it does take law enforcement some cooperation from somebody in the criminal justice system, like a prosecutor or law enforcement, but in my opinion, it's not as onerous. The evidence that's required and the cooperation that's required from law enforcement isn't as stringent as the T visa. And in a state like Montana, where I would say the education level among local law enforcement is pretty low in terms of trafficking and domestic violence and all these types of situations, the U visas were much easier and better avenues for my clients. But I don't know, I mean, I should say in caveat that I haven't had a case, and it's been probably over 3 or 4 years since I've actually directly represented an immigrant victim of violence in one of these cases, and so that could have changed. I know they've been trying to make T visas easier to get because the feds have sort of wrung their hands. Why aren't more people applying for them? But it's like, well, go talk to an attorney and see how easy it is for them. So that sort of segues into, well, I guess I should say that for my the women that came over on fiancé visas and later married their spouses here, the battered spouse waiver is the traditional legal route for them to stay here legally. And Shahid talked a little bit about that. You have to prove that you had a bona fide marriage, and even that is just really bizarre to have immigration officials, bureaucrats sort of interrogate the intimacy level of your client's marriage, and it puts an attorney, I think, in an interesting situation because we have to collect all kinds of stuff from our clients, like love letters and birthday cards. It's very personal, and it's very bizarre to have sort of a government agency interrogate a relationship and then tell you, from their cultural perspective whether they feel like you had a real marriage or not. The whole thing to me is just bizarre, but that's another subject. But I guess a little background on the anti-trafficking law. So in 2007, we did not have a law. There was a really bare bones law that was written that mirrored the federal anti-trafficking law. It was tabled, killed in the Senate Judiciary Committee at the legislature because the senators felt like we did not have a problem like that in Montana. And so it took a strong lobbying effort and individual outreach to every one of those members, and they later ended up changing their votes, and the law passed. So that was good, but what wasn't so good is that it stripped, things that cost money were not passed that session, and so it stripped out of the bill a provision that would pay for training and education for local law enforcement. So just before today, I called the AG's office to see if they had any numbers or any insight on how many prosecutions or what charges were brought under the state law, and they didn't have that information. But I haven't heard of any case brought under our state anti-trafficking law, but there could have been. So my point is, I think there's still an issue, a huge gap in terms of education around, whether the local, patrolman or woman knows whether we even have an anti-trafficking law. So I'm glad that we have wonderful legislators taking up the cause and trying to strengthen that law, because again, it just seems to appear to be on the books, but I don't know that it's used as much as it could be. What else? Oh, I guess I don't have much experience. I know that Bakken was sort of a subject that we were maybe going to get into here, the oil fields and some of the issues that are happening there. So I guess I wrote an article in 2007, I think, around sort of feminist legal theory and approaches to human trafficking, because I was really interested in who the face of trafficking was and who it wasn't. Again, it was, really, pretty young white women, and we were missing whole sectors of actual trafficking victims, which are, there's a lot of men who are trafficked for agriculture, maybe not in Montana, but nationally, and, a lot of women, a lot of non-white women that are also trafficked that I think weren't getting and continue not to get sort of the attention that we give other victims. And I think one of the issues and concerns that at least is a little bit problematic for me when we talk about Bakken is I think that the sex work and the prostitution is sort of being conflated with sex trafficking, and I hear that a lot, like, oh, there's sex trafficking there. Well, how do you know? Well, there was a woman that was, there prostituting. And so I think that language, again, like Shahid was saying, language matters, and I think it's important, at least from my perspective, to be really clear about what trafficking for sex is, and that it does involve, force, fraud, coercion, and that a prostitution situation can turn into sex trafficking, but that they're not the same thing and shouldn't be spoken about the same way. And then I guess with our time, I'll just hand it over to Jen and then maybe get some questions and discussion after that.
Actually, at this point, we'll take a break to make sure we have adequate questions. If you folks could be back a little bit after 4:15, it'd be great. Thank you.
See what I was looking for? Have the CLE sign up. Has anyone not received this? If you're an attorney, this is 2 free CLE credits. I understand those are due soon. Yeah, so we will turn that into the wonderful Patience Woodill here at the law school. She'll make sure that it gets turned into the state bar so you can get these 2 CLE credits. So I'm glad that's going around, and so without further ado, do you have a microphone? Make sure the light's green.
How's that? Is that on?
Okay, so now we're going to transition a little bit. We're lucky enough, again, to have Representative Jennifer Gursky, and she's going to talk about this current session and other laws in Montana. So, thank you.
First of all, thank you for having me. I feel like maybe one of the only non-attorneys in the room. So my framing, my language might be a little different than yours, so please bear with me just a little bit. I'm going to give a quick overview of kind of where I come from and the contextualization of bringing forth, and I think that Cynthia covered it really well, bringing forth legislation in a legislature that really has a hard time contextualizing how, when, where, why trafficking or the threat of trafficking happens in Montana. A couple of years ago, I spent some time in Malaysia working with an NGO called Tenaga Nita, which is Malay for women's power. While I was there, I worked with a bar attorney, which in Malaysia, they actually fashion it a lot like the English system. And so for you that might know that, I have no idea what that means. So again, bear with me. Worked with him a lot on documenting and recording instances of human trafficking. So a lot of my human trafficking experiences actually come from overseas. So I'm gonna build a case that I worked on for you to build some parallels between the Malaysian system and the Malaysian legal system and the inadequacies that I identified. Some parallels I think that the U.S. has identified just in empirical evidence. And I think some of and I might call it xenophobic hubris, that how we have identified policies and how we have exerted certain policies without looking introspectively at our own. So I think it was 2009, 2010. It was in Malaysia. And the organization that I worked with runs a hotline, which has no the national framework and the infrastructure to combat Malaysia. So let me just paint a really quick narrative of Malaysia. Malaysia is probably the #1 economic developer in Southeast Asia. Did not do any economic reforms with IMF or World Bank. Is really called an Asian tiger. So it tends to attract like a magnet from developing nations surrounding it, immigration, labor. They are the #1 exporter in the region. So we're talking about Bangladeshis, Laotians, Vietnamese, peopleless states like the Rohingya, who are a stateless people on the edge of Bangladesh, which we're not even going to talk about the instances that those bring up. Got a call from a group of 6 men that worked with Spectra. We're going to call this company Spectra. They worked on washing machine parts. Their English was obviously non-existent. Their Malay was non-existent. English is the business language. Call in. One of the hotline workers found a translator for them. Went and visited their hostel. Well, the hostel, so like an apartment building that the company pays for, was paid for by the company. They had no documentation whatsoever. They had documentation, but their employers were holding it. And lived under constant threat. And I think that I'm not going to re-explain the coercion and the fraud and the power and feeling as a victim. So I'm not going to go over that because I think that was really well explained. But I think that one of the things that we have to really understand, so I'm sorry, but I'm coming at this from more of a policy activist and less an attorney in that realm, but is the pure dependency that victims feel. And I think we can talk about labor trafficking, we can talk about sex trafficking, we can talk about immigration and domestic violence, but this idea of power and dependency that victims feel. That case, it turns out that they had not been paid for over the course of 13 months. So the economic dependency. They were very afraid of physical violence. One of the gentlemen had his eye, and they did not seek medical treatment. So I'm painting this picture because I thought really, really naively, as an American citizen that was over in the Malaysian state, like, how can they treat their people like this? How come they don't have access to justice? How can they not have public defenders or a legal service to help them? Why would they treat their immigrants like that? Why would they think once the victim has been identified as a victim of trafficking, they lump them with all the other immigrants that didn't have documentation? How could a country that was quote unquote first world nation in Southeast Asia treat people like that? And then I was introduced to the United States. That same summer, I worked with this attorney. They did a Malaysian bar conference, and I was able to work with Susan French, who is a US attorney, who worked on a pineapple plant case in Hawaii that had some of the same indicators that this case did. Same coercive factors. The workers were from Thailand. They had been recruited from Thailand, said that each one of them for $9,000 could come and make lots of money in Hawaii. And then we're expected to pay back the $9,000. We're put in dormitories. We're not allowed out. Papers were seized. And I think sometimes the frustration level that I go to with the Montana legislature, and I try to move forward certain policies, and somebody looks at me and says, this doesn't happen in Montana. Why are we trying to do this? Which is why we get unfunded mandates, because, okay, we'll put something in the MCA, but we're not going to fund it, because it doesn't happen. So I guess I sit up here as, and I'm not sure that I add a lot to the conversation as far as the legality conversation, but I guess more of, I think Cynthia really touched on this with the competency level of our enforcement agents. Whether that be officials of the court, whether that be our law enforcement officials, whether that be our folks, our fighting warriors fighting in a nonprofit sector. I think that I could sit up here and stand on a soapbox and talk about how we've got to start funding DV rescue programs. We've got to start funding, and the other thing is, I couldn't agree more with the T visa component. Like, what's the point? Why even have the T visa? I mean, they're so hard to get for victims. So, let me go back to my notes. I think that when we talk about, and I'll speak, I'm a freshman legislator, so the 2013 legislature had 4 bills proposed that passed, one of which were mine, one of which I co-sponsored, and they all hit it from a different component. I think what you have heard from the panelists today is that sex trafficking is really sexy because it involves a victim that cannot speak for themselves. And so we're going to come in on a shining armored horse and save this victim. When the Thai workers in the pineapple plantation in Hawaii were all Thai men. And we've never seen that splashed across the headlines. One of the bills that was brought from Senator Arntzen from Billings was a vacation of prostitution charges. If a I don't know, person found guilty, what is that word? Person found guilty of prostitution was identified as a victim of trafficking. Well, that sometimes the perfect can be the enemy of the good, and sometimes the good can be the enemy of the best. This is one that I worked in committee on trying. There is a xenophobia in Montana, and there is this sense of us and others. And if there is a sense of there is an accent or a different color of skin, then obviously there's a reason that you're here. And I'm not quite sure why you belong, but gosh darn it, I'm a 6th generation Montanan, and I belong here. Thank you, because half of the room gets that. And I think that that's a culture change and a shift that we really have to address. We can change the MCA. I can bring forward legislation that mandates the DOJ put the National Trafficking Hotline in truck stops. I can do that. But until we have some sort of competency change on not only within our culture, but also within law enforcement, and until we figure out how to work across the system and cross-sector, until our nonprofits can work with our police officers and can work with our courts, the dependency factor that we've heard about today is not going to get fixed. Senator Arntzen's bill was something that I tried to amend in judiciary to just say, while vacating this deemed sentence, or I'm sorry, again, I'm not a lawyer, while saying that, okay, you're actually not a prostitute, you're a victim, there was no language within the bill and no language within the MCA, and there's no infrastructure to say, so you're a victim, but we don't really know what to do with you now. Good job on not being a prostitute. What do we do? What do we do? And what do we do if that victim is a 14-year-old girl that's run away from LA and she's been trafficked up here? Maybe the law enforcement has picked her up and said, okay, well, you were obviously prostituting yourself in a truck stop area. A trucker is called into the hotline, quote unquote, has been rescued. Maybe her being deemed quote unquote rescued is a month later. And yet we have no educational programs. We have no community we definitely have community organizing, but we don't have a state, we don't have officials saying this is important enough for us to fund. That, I think, is the biggest problem in Montana. There was a 24-page bill brought forth by Representative Sarah Laszloffy out of Billings. There are components of it that are good. There are components of it that I think are very prosecution-sided and impose minimum sentencing, which, as little legal knowledge as I have, I'm just not sure that's ever a good idea. But I do think that in the vacuum of knowledge and a vacuum of analysis in the state of Montana, it's 2 inches forward and 1 inch back. So I'm not going to take much longer because I think that you have a great presentation to wrap this up. But I guess in closing, when I say the lack of breadth and depth of analysis, the resolution that didn't pass this session. So yeah, we had a hotline posting, we had the criminal code quote unquote strengthened, and we had money allocated to the Bakken region. I think it was $50,000. It was pennies, but $50,000 for social awareness programs or something like that, and then a resolution. The resolution actually sought to say what codes have been from the AG's office, what has been used for prosecution, how are we tracking data? Are we tracking just abused children that is with somebody in a different town? Or are we saying this child has been trafficked and this is how we rescue? So I think that in the vacuum of data, in the vacuum of analysis, I don't know that I can sit up here and say this is our way forward. I think trafficking, whether it's labor trafficking, and I don't know that there are reports of sugar beet workers. There was of dole workers, though, and so it's not out of the grasp of my imagination that it is working. I do know that there are reports of children, both domestic and foreign nationals, that have been trafficked. But we're not using the codes. And so where's the reliable data? Where's the reliable analyses? And if we are going to do something effective to loop it back around, to move our culture forward in the analyses, and if we're going to build an analysis for our law enforcement and for our officiates of the court, then we've got to start saying we just need to identify the problems and the mechanisms that get us to that problem. The who's, the why's, the what's. One of the reasons there were about 20 votes in the House against the trafficking resolution, and one of my dear colleagues on the other side of the aisle came up to me and said, "We passed 4 bills, what more do you want?" There's got to be an education shift, there's got to be a cultural shift, and there's got to be a competency building. And it comes with us saying, yeah, we live in the last best place, but you know what? Sometimes the last best place has some Band-Aids that need to be examined. So there it is.
So, tough act to follow. It's an interesting situation. The American Bar Association, and maybe a little bit of a backdrop for why the American Bar Association is involved in this issue specifically. I've heard lots of congratulatory comments from the speakers today about roles that are about the Violence Against Women's Act and the reauthorization, about interpreters in the courtroom, about Legal Services Corporation as a whole. And I can tell you without fear of contradiction that but for the American Bar Association, there would not be a Legal Services Corporation, there would not be a reauthorization of Violence Against Women's Act, and there would not be at least some steps taken into getting interpreters in the courtroom. How do we do that? Well, we start with the entity that I chair, the House of Delegates. It's 560 lawyers from around the country, made up of every type of practitioner, every background, every religion, everything. It's the great melting pot, and it is the last great deliberative body in this country. We have orators there that would put every senator and every congressperson to shame. It is my honor to chair that group for 2 years. And in the process of doing that, I've sort of hooked my wagon to a star by the name of Laurel Bellows. She's the current president of the American Bar Association. And she coincidentally happens to be from Illinois, and further coincidentally happens to practice in a firm about the same size as mine. Actually, I think our firm has one more lawyer than hers, and we have 7. She has been interested in this issue of trafficking. And I'm not sure if you folks remember, but in March of 2012, President Obama directed his cabinet to redouble the efforts to eliminate human trafficking. And when I talk about human trafficking, it's easy to get focused, and particularly here in Montana, it's easy to get focused on the issue of immigrant trafficking, on the issue of, well, it's big cities, or it's somebody else's problem, or we don't have that here. Some of these statistics are a few years old, so I'm be willing to bet they're a little dated. But about annually, there's about 14,500 to 17,500 people trafficked into this country on an annual basis. Now that's an alarming statistic. But what's even more alarming is that there hasn't really been an effort to look into domestically what's going on. And in 2005, there was a study that indicated that approximately 250,000 to 325,000 American youth, these are American citizens, we're at risk for exploitation in this country. Exploitation in the form of sex traffic, exploitation in the form of domestic help, exploitation in the form of working in sweatshops, child labor. And so what's being done about that? Back in 1996, the ABA passed a resolution to assist in developing laws to stop to enforce child labor laws and to eradicate that issue. And since that time, we've consistently worked towards the passage of resolutions to deal with violence against women, to deal with violence against immigrants, to deal with trafficking. And most recently, in Dallas at the mid-year meeting of the American Bar Association, we passed 4 resolutions on the issue of decriminalization of sex trafficking, some of the topics that the legislator has brought to us today. Reasons, because there are a significant number of people who are, through the threat of coercion, violence against themselves or violence against their family, either brought into this country or stolen, kidnapped in neighborhoods around the country, or picked up at bus stations and truck stops, kids from great homes, kids from broken homes, kids from all over the country of every type and color. And it is unfortunate that it takes such stunning statistics for us to become awakened. So with a little bit of indulgence, and hopefully I can turn off this and make this work, the American Bar Association, and I'm going to give you my email address in case you can't work your way through this, our website as easily as you like. It's bcarlson@cpklawmt.com. My cell phone number, 490-1054. If anybody in this room wants information about what the ABA is doing about this topic, or frankly any other topic that interests you, let me know. So get to the website to get ABA groups, then you go to ABA leadership, Office of the President. Okay, and once you get there, President Bellows will show up, and we have a task force on human trafficking. And this gives you, this page connects you to a variety of things. Not only what the ABA is doing, but what the resources are around the country. It connects you to what resolutions are being passed at the ABA, what the various states and federal government are doing on the topic. It connects you to social service resources. It connects you to what the Judicial Division of the ABA is doing. And I have the Winter Journal of the Judges Journal on Human Trafficking has a variety of articles written both by judges and practitioners that provide lots of tips for those like yourselves in the field. If you contact me, I have that in an electronic copy and I will send it to you. So there are this page, if you're doing a program, if you are trying to get a handle on this, if you're trying to make people aware of this, whether it's at a local bar association, whether it's at the legislature, whether it's at the Chamber of Commerce, the Rotary, the Exchange Club, the YMCA, the YWCA, the law school, your friends, whatever, you go to this page and there's everything here that you need to know about what's being done. The goal of the task force is to bring a uniform law for adoption by the American Bar Association from the National Commission on Uniform Laws, on uniform state laws. They hope to have that done by August. If it is adopted, then the Commission on Uniform State Laws will take it out to the various legislatures. And it has a pretty decent success rate in adoption of uniform state laws. So we'll keep you posted on that. There is a video here, and I'm not sure, I'm going to try to play at least a portion of it. I'm not sure I can enlarge it enough. This was done by the ABA media department. And
I've been shot 5 times. I've been stabbed over 13
I hope you can
times.
see it, but I can't for some reason enlarge it on this screen.
I have been raped, beaten, kidnapped. I've been in abandoned buildings and alleys. No podía escaparme.
I could not escape. I was worried that they would hurt my family.
And they say, if you try to flee, I will kill your mother.
This is not some Hollywood fantasy, this is reality, and it's happening here.
The most reliable estimates of human trafficking worldwide is there's about 27 million people who are trapped in slavery around the world.
Last year, we identified 42,000 people, less than 1% of the people who are trafficked in the world. We have a lot of work to do.
Trafficking is one of the most fundamental violations of human rights.
We have an obligation to step up and make a difference. Nobody has the right to buy another human being. I thought Abraham Lincoln fixed that stuff.
150 years ago, President Abraham Lincoln set out to abolish slavery. And he did it right here at what is now called Lincoln's Cottage, just 3 miles from the White House. And it was here that President Lincoln drafted what the Chicago Tribune called the grandest proclamation ever issued, the Emancipation Proclamation. But despite Lincoln's legacy, we have slaves in this country.
Human trafficking is slavery. It is modern slavery.
There are victims who are brought here every day who are forced to live in the homes of their traffickers, work horrible conditions, 60, 70, 80 hours a week for no pay. And they're really isolated without any way to escape their situations.
There is a misconception that trafficking victims only are foreign-born or non-citizens that are brought into the United States from other countries.
They could be down the street from where you live. They're really right next door to us.
It can happen to anyone at any time, child or adult, no matter what their race, no matter what their income.
They may be runaways, they may be school dropouts, they may come from a broken home or not have any parents or guardians taking care of them. They may be in foster care.
There are also the men, women, and children who you see working as janitors in a hotel setting.
A trafficked person is someone who is compelled into labor or commercial sex through force, fraud, or coercion.
Or when the person involved in commercial sex is younger than 18 years old.
14 to 16 is a common age of entry. So it makes sense to stop treating anyone under the age of 18 as a criminal.
I was picked up at 15. I actually went to the police. I said I had a pimp. I said I was a juvenile. They charged me with prostitution. My lawyer told me to take the plea because I was a prostitute.
The traditional notion in the police world that these were all criminals out there, it just didn't apply. The people that we were dealing with were victims, and it was really straightforward. It was very clear.
We have been arresting the wrong people. We need to arrest the buyers and the traffickers and not arrest the victims.
A lot of people have this vision of the human trafficker as, something out of Hollywood. But a lot of what we have in the United States is opportunistic employers. Whether it's a crew leader on an agricultural setting who decides that the best way to keep his folks from running off is to take their passports and to threaten them with beatings. Whether it's a pimp who's running a couple of child prostitutes on the street.
And where a pimp and a trafficker starts and stops, there is no distinction. I mean, they're really one and the same.
It's the demand that is actually fueling the supply. So we absolutely have to go after the demand or it's not going to end. You can lock up all day, I'm all for it. But just know it's not going to stop.
As lawyers, we are uniquely qualified to fight modern slavery. One of the first steps is to get training. And the American Bar Association can connect you to those who work in the trenches. Experts who will help you learn how to identify victims, represent survivors, and transform lives.
Victims of trafficking are vulnerable because they don't have a voice in society. And what do lawyers do? At our best, we give other people a voice.
There are thousands of trafficking victims who need legal representation. As a lawyer, I can help them rebuild their lives.
I think lawyers need to develop an expertise in recognizing the red flags of human trafficking.
Judges get trained on patent cases, civil rights cases, constitutional law cases, but we don't have training on human trafficking cases, and that is something we need.
If you work on commercial transactions, you can help a shelter set up the services that they need for the trafficking victims. If you work on a white-collar practice or a criminal law practice, you can certainly do volunteer work for the women and girls who are being accused of prostitution offenses, so that the prosecutors can understand that maybe they aren't criminals, maybe they're somebody who needs help.
And we could not do our work without pro bono lawyers. They are the heart and soul of our ability to help our clients.
A lot of us went to law school to really help individuals, and this is a case in which you can really see visible results of helping a particular person escape from often really horrendous circumstances.
President Lincoln believed that slavery violated fundamental principles of justice, and we fought for that belief. In Lincoln's words, slavery is founded in the selfishness of man's nature, and opposition to it in his love of justice. It's time for us to demonstrate our love of justice. It's time for us to advocate for the eradication of slavery in this country, to reinvigorate the principles of the Emancipation Proclamation, and to assure that once again, our country can guarantee freedom for all.
Gracias a ustedes, aquí estoy.
Thanks to my lawyers. Without their help, I wouldn't be here today.
Darle gracias, pues, no sé.
I want to give them my thanks for all of their help, for helping me get my freedom.
So, within this website, there's several links that get you to what's being done in training, what's being done hopefully the lights will come back up at some point. What the task force is doing, where it's going in terms of training of businesses, in terms of training of lawyers and other people, how to spot issues of trafficking, how to spot victims of trafficking. We are trying to create best business standards so that employers recognize what might be happening in some parts of their companies. It is a broad-based effort within the association. Every section has some component that is dealing with this issue, from the litigation and the business law section to the criminal justice section to the young lawyers division to the student lawyers. They're all getting involved. We encourage you to get involved. We encourage you, if you aren't a member of the association, please consider joining. We cannot do this without you. As we move forward, in September, we celebrate the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. And in that proclamation, President Lincoln made a promise for the freedom of the slaves of his time, but also a promise for the future. He said, "I do order that all persons held as slaves are, and henceforward shall be free." Let us, take a stand here and now and do something about this. Thanks for your time.
Well, thank you so much for that. We have until 10 after 5 if we have any questions for our panelists, or if they have questions for each other or other comments that they'd like to make. Please, not all at once.
My name is Katarina Werner. I'm the shelter manager here at the YWCA, and I really appreciate that we are talking about this topic, because it is really such an important topic, I think, to discuss in Montana. And so to, kind of add the advocacy perspective within this conversation, I wrote down a few things that I think are just really important to mention. There's a couple of questions that I have. And so, a couple of things that were said that I really appreciate is, how do we contextualize what human trafficking victims look like in the state of Montana, because I think there's a huge disconnect, because people think, these things happen in California, down at the Mexican border. This is something that only happens to foreign nationals. It is something that involves transportation or trafficking across borders. And so I think, to give Montana a face for a trafficking victim, it is, somebody mentioned the 15-year-old minor that's run away from home, vulnerable populations. That we absolutely work with as advocates in our shelters and in our nonprofit systems on a daily basis. And I think the problem is that it's easy for people to say it doesn't happen in Montana. And I think it's easy to say that for many things, because if we don't know what to look for, it's easy to say it doesn't happen. So definitely the first step is that education piece, because there's so many things to look for in terms of red flags and risk factors, like somebody was saying the runaway kid, and yes, the immigrant that is not English efficient, and English isn't their first language. And so then from an advocate's perspective, I think the overlap between domestic violence dynamics and the power and control, it's huge. I mean, those dynamics are pretty much the same, and there's that added layer of risk and vulnerability. And so I think, we in the YWC, we at the YWC, we've worked with really, literally under 5 victims of trafficking. Looking back, I had the privilege to go to a couple wonderful trainings, one recently, a 3-day training in San Francisco on exactly this topic. And so the knowledge that I gathered and what I learned, it made me realize, in my head I went back thinking about other families or other women that I've worked with over the years, and it just kind of was that aha effect of, I've worked with victims of domestic violence, some of them immigrants, who were also victims of forced labor or of sex trafficking. And so I think that education in law enforcement and for attorneys, and then working with advocates, I think we can totally get there and provide these services, but the biggest piece is just, being informed on the issue. In terms of, a task force, it's exciting to hear that things like that are happening. It sounds like, so is this happening, that's a task force that's being formed in Montana? Is that what you were talking about, or on a national level?
It's on a national level.
Okay.
The American Bar Association, it's formed, it's been working for about 6 months. We've already had 4 resolutions adopted by the House that they, with another section, brought forward. They put on several training programs and summits around the country. There was one in the fall in Seattle in conjunction with several different practitioners, psychologists, social workers, family shelters, women's shelters, etc., and the GP, general practice, solo and small firm division of the American Bar Association. So it attracted a few thousand people, and they've been doing those around the country.
And so from my end, the pitch that I'm going to make here, or just reaching out, is that about 6 months ago as well, we did start working together as a local task force here in Missoula, involving law enforcement, involving criminal advocates and community advocates. And so then, realizing that this is a huge task to take on in terms of, there is no funding, there's just limited knowledge around this issue. And then obviously if the statute that we have, which is so weak, we're like on that really lower quartile of our law doesn't have any teeth really. But just kind of that pledge of, if there's anybody, I mean, we're in the process of really reaching out to kind of the legal piece of getting somebody on board that can actually work with us. We're law enforcement and advocates, and then trying to figure out, if we have a case that involves not necessarily foreign nationals, but how do we even get them the legal assistance that they need? I think we're that far behind in Montana. And so I'm not trying to sound like demotivating or, but it is true, like Jen was saying, it's just, there's just not a concept within our communities of what it really looks like. So I think that's kind of the fight that we're fighting. But yeah, I'm just excited to hear that this is happening and that people are being educated. So I might reach out to either one of you up here or somebody in the legal community to see if somebody might be interested in joining the task force, because things are being done in Montana, but it's pretty disconnected and disjointed, like who is doing what and how can we bring everybody together. So yeah, thanks you guys.
Thank you so much for that. Other questions?
I mean, really, is legal service?
Just 1 second.
Oh, sorry. I guess I.
Stand back there.
I'm just curious, because it's very heartening to see that legal services is doing so much, and that under your project that there was a lot done. And I'm just wondering, is there a phone number? Do you guys actually take referrals? And what are the limitations of the services that are actually provided legally for immigrants or foreign nationals, or for all those different issues that raise immigration issues? I mean, I'm so glad you do so much of the work that you do, because 30 years ago there wasn't. Anyway, I'm just curious what the current status of actual access to representation is in Montana.
Do you have a microphone up there? Or?
Well, you should start.
Well, through legal services, like I said, the referrals that I've gotten have usually come through shelters or just through the work I've done on reservations, because there are immigrant victims on reservations as well. It's always a question of staff, how much individual staff members can take on. We're at a point now where most of the DV organizations statewide are in funding crunches, and legal services is no different with regard to our domestic violence funding. We're kind of in between cycles. We're very grateful to have somebody who's helped us with a number of cases on the immigration side. It's been nice to have that resource, and we've emailed back and forth on issues. We certainly, have called, and I'm sure many of you are aware that legal services have really called on the pro bono community to help us out, kind of fill the gap, because we have, I think, 13 attorneys statewide, and, to meet the needs of all legal needs. Obviously, that's not going to happen. People call in. We certainly refer, and if we can take the case, we will, or we try to find pro bono assistance for them. That's why I'm making the pitch, to make sure that you all understand that those of you that are law students, when you graduate, it's really rewarding. I mean, domestic violence work is rewarding in general, and working with immigrant victims in particular, because of the dynamics, because the powerlessness is. I don't know if that really answers your question. Why don't you talk a little bit about your organization that you've started with? Yeah, I was going to say he needs to get some credit for that.
And as they're passing the microphones, I'd like to note that we will be posting a video of this CLE on the law school's website, as well as, if anyone didn't get the handouts and materials, those will be in PDF and downloadable if you want to share them with anyone else. So back to you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and just to add to that in terms of what services are available. So, in a way, what we've been talking about today, and some of the differences in different people's perspectives, I think it goes down to the definition of what you mean by human trafficking. And I think that there are a lot of different things that might be missing one component of it, and maybe you don't call it human trafficking any longer. But in terms of in terms of foreign workers who have been drawn into the country and had their jobs taken away, and now they're stripped with no way to get back home. I've seen that. Is that human trafficking? Under some, yeah, you could maybe call that human trafficking. I haven't been considering it that way, but maybe that's wrong. Maybe they were trafficked. They came of their own free will, but had the situation changed on them. They're not in indentured servitude per se. They're not slaves, and I'm very careful in using slavery terminology when I'm referring to my clients and the people that constituencies that I represent, because not only is it not particularly helpful sometimes to refer to people as being powerless and literally slaves, it's not it's really demeaning in some ways to them if that's not quite what their situation is. And, honestly, it's probably demeaning to, descendants of African Americans who were actually, their ancestors were actually slaves. And so I think you got to be careful in how you define stuff. And I guess you know that about me since I complained about mail order brides and all that stuff. But so in terms of services that are available, if you are somebody who is an undocumented immigrant who has been trafficked into the country but not subject to domestic violence, not subject to sex trafficking, you may have you may have like almost no services available to you in terms of access to the legal system. Montana Legal Services can't represent you because you're undocumented and you're not a VAWA victim. So their funding will not permit that. In terms of access to representation, if you're an undocumented immigrant, you have no legal right to you have a legal right to representation, but not at cost to the federal government. So the federal government does not have any obligation to provide you with a public defender or anyone of that nature unless you're being charged with a crime. So there's a list of free legal service providers that the federal Department of Homeland Security maintains. That's a list that is commonly misunderstood as being people who are public defenders. I'm on the list, but what it actually is a list of people who are willing, under some circumstances, if their time permits and if they can, and if your case is compelling enough, to take your case on a pro bono basis. And so I do a lot of pro bono work, but it's unfunded. There's no funding for that. It's just basically if I can, and if sometimes the difference between me taking a case and not taking a case is if immigration officers piss me off, honestly, and that sometimes, if they really make me mad enough, I'll take a case. So, but I work with Doves, and we've got some people from Doves and MCA, DSV, Montana Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence, and I've worked with Montana Legal Services on different things. So there's lots of different ways that domestic violence manifests itself, and it can be part of a divorce proceeding that Montana Legal Services can totally get involved in and do. It can be part of a criminal prosecution that's unjustified. It can be part of an immigration case that's VAWA, so there is funding for that. Or it could be part of deportation proceedings where there's no specific VAWA claim, but it doesn't fall into any of the factors where anybody will step in and help. It's kind of one of those things where we really do need more help, and we need more help in situations where there are big gaps in coverage, where Montana Legal Services can't get involved, and where there's no other specific funding for it. And so right now I'm doing some stuff, but by no means am I able to fulfill the need on my own. I'm just one guy, and so. It's definitely something that I'm looking forward to partnering up with lawyers with other domestic violence organizations, where by working as co-counsel with them, they can accomplish a lot more, and I can just advise and do that. But kind of one thing, totally off topic, but in terms of like definitions of human trafficking and how you conceptualize it, I was just thinking to myself about. I'm aware of a program where it's actually a federal government program that is causing mass displacement of people in their home countries, causing them to lose their jobs, having entire industries dry up, forcing them to relocate to find somewhere to work, and then once they come into the country, it's causing them to work for lower wages and lack of workplace protections. And actually, the program I'm talking about is called NAFTA. So, in terms of how you consider human trafficking and the effects it has, there's a few different ways you can look at it.
Would our panelists like to make any other comments, or?
Well, I would just like to put in a little plug. I think Shahid was being really modest, as was Lori, and we have some Doves attorneys here. There are about a handful of attorneys, probably less than 10 in Montana, that do so much for the immigrant population in our state, and they do it pro bono. And Shahid's won awards. He takes a lot of cases that no one will take, and he helps provide technical assistance. And it's been amazing, I think, to see some of the progress that he's made. But it would just be my plug that as you, if you're a law student moving forward into your own practice, whether it be family law or criminal law or any other type of law, that you would consider doing or taking an immigration case, because there is technical assistance out there for you. Even if somebody might not be able to take the case, they can perhaps, like Shahid, provide you with support, and they are very rewarding cases, I think, because it's really life-changing, and you can keep somebody with their kids and keep somebody from being deported into a really horrible situation. So that would be my plug, and thank you guys for coming.